Imagine living in a country where your opportunities, safety, and daily experiences are constantly shaped by the color of your skin. For Black Americans, this is not a distant memory of the past, it is a reality that continues to affect lives today. Across the United States, systemic inequalities persist in critical areas such as incarceration, healthcare, education, housing, employment, and access to public services, from disproportionately long jail sentences to limited access to quality medical care. From segregated neighborhoods to unequal job opportunities, the barriers are real and pervasive. These disparities are not just numbers on a page, they are lived experiences. They influence where families can live, how children are educated, and whether adults can secure stable, well-paying jobs. The ripple effects reach into every aspect of life, shaping communities and determining who has access to the resources that many take for granted. In this video, we will take you on a journey through some of the towns and cities in America where racial disparities are most visible. We will explore the history behind these inequalities, share stories from the people living through them, and examine how communities are fighting for change. By understanding these realities, we can learn the importance of advocacy, awareness, and action in creating a more equitable society. If you care about understanding these issues and want to stay informed about stories that matter, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with your friends and family so together we can shed light on these pressing challenges and inspire conversations that lead to real change. Your support helps us continue bringing these important narratives to light. As we dive deeper into the everyday realities faced by Black Americans, it becomes painfully clear that systemic inequality is not confined to statistics or historical accounts. It lives in the ordinary spaces we often take for granted. Picture walking into a store, only to feel the invisible barrier of suspicion looming over you, a subtle judgment in the glance of the cashier, or being followed through aisles as if your presence is an inconvenience rather than a customer experience. Imagine stepping into a restaurant and sensing a divide, not in the menu or the decor, but in the attention and warmth extended to you compared to others around you. A difference that is felt rather than always spoken. These seemingly small moments accumulate over time, shaping an environment where Black individuals constantly navigate microaggressions that chip away at dignity and opportunity. The challenges extend far beyond public spaces into the essential arenas of economic and civic life. Job applications, for example, are often arenas of invisible discrimination. Qualified candidates may see opportunities vanish because of biases embedded in the system or unspoken judgments during interviews. Loans that could provide a family with a home, fund an education, or start a business are denied disproportionately, leaving communities with limited pathways to wealth accumulation and stability. Voting, a cornerstone of democracy, is another area where obstacles quietly reinforce inequality. From convoluted registration processes to limited polling access in predominantly Black neighborhoods, the exercise of political voice is met with barriers designed not to intimidate, but often with effects that disproportionately disenfranchise. In schools, children encounter implicit messages that subtly shape their sense of belonging and potential. Teachers' expectations, disciplinary practices, and access to resources frequently differ along racial lines, influencing both immediate learning experiences and long-term educational trajectories. Health care, another pillar of well-being, is similarly affected. Black patients frequently report being dismissed, undertreated, or facing longer waits, creating a cycle where medical needs intersect with social inequities to produce measurable disparities in life outcomes. Housing, too, carries echoes of past injustices that persist in zoning laws, lending practices, and neighborhood investment, ensuring that Black families often find themselves limited to areas with fewer amenities. higher risks, and less generational wealth-building potential. This continuous interplay of subtle and overt discrimination illustrates that the struggle is not merely historical, it is lived daily, in spaces both public and private, in encounters both large and minute. Each instance, whether it is an unfairly denied loan, a cautious glance from a store employee, a classroom with limited resources, or a neighborhood lacking infrastructure, contributes to a larger pattern of systemic inequity. These realities weave together to form a web that is difficult to untangle. Yet it is precisely this interconnectedness that demands attention, understanding, and action. By tracing the paths where these experiences manifest, from streets and workplaces to schools and healthcare centers, one begins to see the depth of resilience required for Black individuals to navigate life in the United States. The story is not just one of struggle, but also of perseverance, of communities building networks of support, advocating for equity, and asserting presence in spaces that have historically sought to marginalize them. The everyday challenges in public interactions, employment, financial access, and civic participation reveal a complex landscape where inequality is maintained not only through laws or policies, but through patterns of behavior and systemic structures that silently dictate who is allowed to thrive. This is the lived reality behind the numbers, the historical context, and the headlines, a continuous thread that connects past oppression to present-day challenges, reminding us that understanding and addressing these patterns is essential not only for fairness, but for the very fabric of a society striving toward equity. As we turn our focus to specific locations where the weight of history and contemporary bias is most pronounced, it becomes evident that certain towns in the United States embody the lingering tensions of racial inequality in striking ways. Pulaski, Tennessee, for instance, is more than just a point on a map. It is a town with deep historical ties to the formation of the Ku Klux Klan, a group that has left an enduring mark on the collective memory of the community. Walking through its streets, one can sense the layers of history, where the echoes of past oppression mingle with the efforts of locals striving to redefine their city through projects, museums, and cultural awareness. Here, the past is not simply remembered, it shapes the lived experiences of residents today, reminding Black individuals that vigilance and resilience are necessary just to navigate daily life. Further north in Danville, Illinois, the scars of racially motivated violence and riots punctuate the city's history. From the deadly events at Virginia Market in the late 19th century to tensions that surfaced as recently as 2022. These moments reveal a city where the shadows of the past continue to influence community dynamics, where even decades later, the subtle threads of segregation and mistrust persist in education, employment, and residential patterns. Fresno, California, tells a different story yet underscores the same reality. Home to an unusually high concentration of hate groups, the city reflects how organized prejudice can influence neighborhoods and neighborhoods' sense of safety, contributing to an environment where communities of color navigate constant challenges to their security and opportunity. In Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the urban-suburban divide illustrates the complex intersection of politics and race. Voting patterns reveal a mosaic of neighborhoods sharply delineated by racial composition, while economic and social divides further reinforce inequality, showing how segregation is not merely physical but embedded in the very mechanisms that shape community life. Similarly, Racine, Wisconsin, stands out for its entrenched disparities in employment, homeownership, and education, where Black residents must work tirelessly just to achieve parity with their white neighbors, only to face systemic barriers that seem to multiply with every step forward. Crown Heights in Brooklyn, New York, offers yet another perspective, where historically Black neighborhoods face the compounded challenges of media portrayal, economic disadvantage, and lingering segregation. The stories of families navigating these pressures. Seeking education, safety, and justice illustrate that inequality is not abstract. It is woven into the daily routines of millions. Peoria, Illinois, echoes these patterns, highlighting disparities in income, health outcomes, and property ownership, while Mississippi's deep-seated history of slavery and Jim Crow laws continues to influence opportunities and social perceptions. Harrison, Arkansas, with its history of race riots and continued minimal black population, exemplifies how some towns maintain a cultural memory that subtly dictates who belongs and who is marginalized. Finally, Waterloo, Iowa, demonstrates how segregation and unequal access to resources, voting, and education combine to shape a modern environment still grappling with the consequences of racial prejudice. Each of these towns tells a story that is both unique and connected, illustrating the many forms racial inequality can take, from overt hostility to systemic neglect, and showing how history and policy intertwine to shape the present. By examining these locations together, one begins to understand not only the scale of the challenge, but also the resilience of the communities that continue to push for equity and justice, proving that the fight against racial discrimination is both a shared struggle and a deeply personal journey for those living within it. To truly understand the landscapes of inequality and tension that shape the lives of Black Americans today, one must trace the roots of these challenges deep into history, where the foundations of systemic racism were laid through centuries of oppression and exclusion. The institution of slavery was the first and most brutal manifestation of this system, creating a social and economic hierarchy designed to exploit human beings for labor while stripping them of dignity, agency, and identity. Enslaved Africans and their descendants were subjected to inhumane treatment, and the consequences of this violence echoed far beyond the plantation. Shaping laws, social norms, and community structures for generations to come. Following emancipation, the promise of freedom was quickly undermined by the Jim Crow era, a period during which segregation became codified and legally enforced across the southern United States. Black Americans were systematically denied access to quality education, equitable employment, and safe public spaces, and they faced constant threats of violence should they challenge the boundaries imposed upon them. The specter of the Ku Klux Klan, which flourished during this era, added a chilling layer of terror. Its members used intimidation, public lynching, and threats to enforce a social order where white supremacy remained unchallenged, and the psychological scars of these tactics have lingered for decades. Even beyond the South, discriminatory practices found subtler forms. Redlining, the practice of denying mortgages and financial services based on neighborhood racial composition, ensured that Black families were confined to under-resourced areas while barred from accumulating generational wealth through homeownership. Restrictive covenants legally prohibited the sale of properties to Black buyers in many communities, maintaining racially homogeneous neighborhoods and limiting opportunities for upward mobility. These legal structures intertwined with social norms, reinforcing segregation in schools, workplaces, and public institutions, and shaping patterns of inequality that persist into the present. The effects of these historical systems are visible in the disparities we discussed in previous sections: disproportionate incarceration rates, inequities in healthcare and education, economic obstacles, and segregated neighborhoods. They are not simply vestiges of the past. They are active forces that continue to influence access, opportunity, and social perception. Each town we explored from Pulaski to Waterloo carries its own imprint of these historical dynamics, where the echoes of slavery, Jim Crow, Kekek activity, and discriminatory laws intersect with contemporary challenges to shape the lived realities of Black residents. The legacy of these systems is often subtle, expressed through unequal educational resources, differential treatment in public services, or the concentration of poverty in certain neighborhoods. Yet the cumulative impact is profound, demonstrating how deeply historical injustices are woven into the social fabric of America. Understanding this continuum is crucial for recognizing why addressing racism requires more than surface-level interventions. It is a structural problem, rooted in centuries of policies and cultural attitudes that have codified inequality and created patterns difficult to break. By examining both history and current experiences, we see how the past is not separate from the present but actively shapes it, guiding the disparities in opportunity, safety, and well-being that Black communities navigate daily. Acknowledging this context provides a framework for meaningful change, emphasizing that solutions must address both the visible inequities of today and the invisible legacies of yesterday, ensuring that the journey toward justice is grounded in truth and historical awareness. Across the United States, the echoes of past violence reverberate through communities in ways that are felt long after the events themselves have faded from immediate memory, shaping the lived experiences of Black residents and the contours of social life. Many towns carry scars from histories of racial violence, riots, and targeted attacks that were often orchestrated to enforce segregation and suppress any challenge to white dominance. In some places, entire neighborhoods bear the memory of nights when mobs of white residents descended to burn homes, assault families, and drive Black families from their communities. Acts designed not only to inflict immediate harm but to instill fear for generations to come. These moments of terror were not isolated incidents. They were often systemic, supported by law enforcement inaction or even tacit approval from local authorities, and they became part of the collective consciousness of both Black and white residents, shaping patterns of settlement, opportunity, and social interaction for decades. In towns like Harrison, Arkansas, historical accounts describe white mobs taking violent action against Black residents, whipping individuals and burning houses in a bid to remove them from the town entirely. Families fled in search of safety, scattering to neighboring areas, while those who stayed were forced to live under constant threat, a situation reinforced by a broader culture of white supremacy that dominated social, economic, and political life. Similarly, in Danville, Illinois, the memory of racially motivated riots and attacks remains a haunting reminder of the fragility of safety for Black communities, where even decades later, tensions and mistrust can flare in response to perceived threats or injustices. The repercussions of these events extend far beyond the immediate victims, influencing how communities are structured, how resources are distributed, and how Black residents perceive their place in towns that were once marked by open hostility. Even where overt acts of violence have subsided, the legacy of these attacks manifests in economic and social disparities. Neighborhoods that were historically targeted or forcibly segregated often remain underfunded, with limited access to quality education, healthcare, and employment opportunities, reinforcing a cycle of marginalization. The psychological impact is equally profound. Living in a town with a known history of racial hostility can shape everyday decisions, from where families choose to live and send their children to school, to how individuals navigate public spaces, workplaces, and political participation. These towns, though varying in size and geography, share a common thread. The history of targeted violence against Black residents is never entirely erased, and it continues to inform the rhythms of life and the resilience required to thrive despite systemic obstacles. In addition, media portrayals and local narratives often amplify the stigma associated with towns that have histories of racial violence, framing Black residents' experiences as anomalies or personal misfortune rather than the predictable consequences of structural inequity. This misrepresentation further isolates communities, making it harder to address the underlying issues and fostering a cycle in which past violence indirectly shapes present opportunities. Understanding these towns' histories is not merely an exercise in chronicling events. It is essential to comprehending the full scope of systemic racism and its enduring impact on communities across America. It is through this lens that we see the interconnectedness of historical violence. Economic disparity, social segregation, and ongoing prejudice, illustrating that the path to equity requires both acknowledgement of the past and deliberate efforts to dismantle the structures that allow such histories to continue influencing the present. The economic realities faced by Black communities in America reveal the enduring consequences of historical and systemic inequities, a narrative that becomes unmistakably clear when we examine poverty rates, unemployment figures, and homeownership statistics. In many towns and cities, Black families are disproportionately represented among those living in poverty, struggling to make ends meet despite working multiple jobs or dedicating long hours to gainful employment. These disparities are not the result of a lack of effort or ambition. Rather, they are the direct outcome of structural barriers that have constrained opportunities for generations. From discriminatory lending practices to unequal educational resources that limit pathways to higher-paying jobs. In cities like Racine, Wisconsin, for instance, the contrast is stark. While a substantial portion of white residents are able to accumulate wealth and secure stable housing, Black residents face unemployment rates more than double those of their white neighbors. And homeownership, a key vehicle for building generational wealth, is accessible to only a fraction of the population. This economic imbalance extends beyond mere numbers. It shapes the daily experiences of families, the aspirations of children, and the sense of possibility within entire communities. Neighborhoods with high poverty rates often face underfunded schools, limited access to healthcare, and reduced public investment, creating a cycle in which economic disadvantage is perpetuated rather than alleviated. Black residents navigating these conditions often confront a double burden: the systemic obstacles to financial stability and the social stigma attached to living in historically marginalized areas. In contrast, white communities benefit from decades of accumulated wealth, reinforced by policies like redlining and restrictive covenants that historically prevented Black families from accessing the same opportunities. The consequences are still visible today in the distribution of resources, the condition of housing stock, and the opportunities available to residents. Homeownership, in particular, serves as a lens through which these disparities are vividly illustrated. Owning a home is more than a personal achievement. It is a cornerstone for building intergenerational security, passing on wealth, and establishing stability within a community. For many Black families, however, historical restrictions, discriminatory lending practices, and systemic barriers have limited access to this foundational asset. As a result, neighborhoods that could otherwise thrive through local investment and community engagement often remain under-resourced, while white families benefit from decades of equity growth and stable property values. Employment disparities further compound these challenges. Even when Black individuals secure jobs, wage gaps and limited advancement opportunities create a persistent inequality that makes escaping poverty a more difficult and prolonged process. The interplay of poverty, unemployment, and homeownership is not isolated to individual hardships. It shapes the broader social landscape, influencing education, healthcare, and civic engagement. Children growing up in economically disadvantaged Black neighborhoods may face underfunded schools and fewer extracurricular opportunities, which in turn affect academic outcomes and long-term career prospects. Access to quality healthcare is often constrained by economic limitations, leading to disparities in health outcomes and life expectancy. The cycle of disadvantage becomes self-reinforcing, illustrating that economic inequality is both a cause and consequence of systemic racial disparities. By examining these statistics alongside the historical and social contexts we have explored in earlier sections, it becomes clear that economic inequality is inseparable from the broader narrative of racial injustice in America. Poverty rates, unemployment figures, and homeownership disparities are not simply markers of financial hardship. They are indicators of a system that has long constrained opportunities for Black communities while providing advantages to white residents. Understanding these patterns is essential to recognizing the scale of the challenge and the resilience required by those striving for equity, revealing that the struggle for economic justice is deeply intertwined with the fight against broader systemic racism. Education has long been celebrated as a pathway to opportunity, a means through which individuals can break cycles of poverty and achieve social mobility. Yet for many Black residents in America, systemic barriers have rendered that pathway fraught with obstacles, limiting access to higher education and perpetuating cycles of inequality. Across numerous towns and cities, the rates of college attainment among Black populations remain significantly lower than those of their white counterparts, a reflection not of capability or ambition, but of structural inequities embedded in schooling systems. Economic resources and social support networks. From the earliest years in underfunded elementary schools, students in predominantly Black neighborhoods often encounter larger class sizes, outdated materials, and fewer extracurricular opportunities, all of which compound over time to affect academic readiness and confidence. These educational disparities are further exacerbated by economic pressures. Black students are more likely to come from families facing financial hardship, where the need to contribute to household income or navigate unstable living conditions can interfere with academic performance and aspirations. Even when students excel academically, systemic obstacles in college admissions and financial aid processes often impose additional burdens, creating a scenario in which highly capable students may find higher education financially or logistically out of reach. In cities like Racine and Milwaukee, Wisconsin, these patterns are particularly visible. While white residents achieve college degrees at rates that enable greater access to higher-paying jobs and stable careers, Black residents contend with a combination of historical segregation, under-resourced schools, and limited mentorship or guidance, all of which contribute to lower college attainment. The consequences of these educational gaps ripple through every facet of life, shaping career trajectories. Economic stability and community development. Without higher education credentials, Black individuals face barriers to competitive employment, advancement opportunities, and the ability to accumulate wealth through high-paying careers, reinforcing economic disparities that have roots stretching back generations. Moreover, the lack of access to quality education often intersects with other systemic issues, including discriminatory hiring practices, neighborhood segregation, and unequal access to health and social services, creating a multi-layered network of challenges that are difficult to disentangle. Yet within these constraints, stories of resilience and determination emerge. Students, families, and educators in Black communities continually seek ways to overcome systemic barriers, whether through mentorship programs, community initiatives, scholarship opportunities, or advocacy for equitable school funding. These efforts demonstrate that while systemic challenges are deeply entrenched, they are not insurmountable, and that the pursuit of education remains a critical battleground in the fight for equality. The gap in college attainment is not simply a statistic. It is a reflection of the cumulative effect of historical injustices, present-day discrimination, and persistent inequities that shape access to opportunity and quality of life. By connecting these educational disparities to the broader narratives of economic hardship, historical violence, and systemic racism explored earlier, it becomes evident that lower rates of college attainment among Black residents are part of a continuum of inequality. They are both a product of and a contributor to the complex web of challenges facing Black communities, illustrating how education, opportunity, and systemic bias are inextricably linked. Recognizing and addressing these barriers is essential not only for individual success, but for the long-term health and equity of entire communities, underscoring the need for comprehensive reforms that ensure every student, regardless of race or background, has the tools and support necessary to pursue higher education and the opportunities it affords. In cities like Milwaukee and Peoria, the story of racial inequality is inseparable from the physical and political landscapes that have long shaped daily life, where residential segregation and unequal political influence work in tandem to reinforce deep divides and perpetuate systemic inequities. Walking through Milwaukee, one can observe neighborhoods sharply delineated along racial lines, a product of decades of discriminatory housing policies, economic disparities, and patterns of migration that saw white residents leave urban centers for suburban areas, while Black residents often remained concentrated in under-resourced neighborhoods. These spatial separations are more than just lines on a map. They reflect and reinforce access to opportunity, influencing which schools receive funding, where businesses invest, and how social services are allocated, creating an environment in which communities of color are systematically disadvantaged in nearly every facet of life. Political influence mirrors these divisions. In Milwaukee, the concentration of Black residents in specific neighborhoods often means that their collective voice is diluted in municipal elections, limiting the capacity to effect policy changes that directly benefit their communities. The result is a paradox. While these neighborhoods may be densely populated and culturally vibrant, they frequently lack the political clout to challenge systemic issues such as underfunded schools, inequitable policing practices, or insufficient infrastructure investment. In Peoria, the story is similar, where historical patterns of segregation have shaped not only the distribution of housing, but also the allocation of political power, leaving Black residents underrepresented in local government and decision-making processes that influence their daily lives. These patterns are not incidental, but rather the outcome of historical and structural factors that have long constrained the ability of Black communities to access resources and participate fully in civic life. Redlining, restrictive covenants, and discriminatory lending practices created enduring economic and spatial disparities, while voter suppression tactics, gerrymandering, and unequal representation compounded the problem, ensuring that Black residents had limited avenues to influence the political and social frameworks governing their neighborhoods. Even today, these legacies manifest in tangible ways. Public schools in predominantly Black areas often face budget shortfalls. Community centers and recreational facilities are fewer and underfunded, and economic development projects tend to bypass these neighborhoods, reinforcing cycles of marginalization. The impact of residential segregation and political disenfranchisement extends beyond material disadvantages. It also shapes perceptions, social networks, and opportunities for upward mobility. Children growing up in segregated neighborhoods face educational gaps that affect college readiness and long-term career prospects, while adults encounter barriers to employment, healthcare, and business opportunities that are less prevalent in more integrated or politically empowered areas. Social cohesion within these communities is often strong, fueled by shared experiences and cultural heritage. Yet the isolation imposed by segregation can limit exposure to broader networks and resources, perpetuating inequality across generations. Understanding Milwaukee and Peoria in this context illuminates a broader national pattern. Segregation and unequal political influence are not relics of the past but active mechanisms that continue to shape life for Black Americans. the physical separation of communities and the marginalization of voices in decision-making processes work together to entrench disparities in education, employment, healthcare, and housing, reinforcing a cycle that is difficult to break. By examining these dynamics, we gain insight into how structural inequities operate on both spatial and political levels, highlighting the importance of policies and initiatives aimed at promoting integration. Equitable representation and resource allocation, while acknowledging the resilience and agency of communities navigating these challenges every day. Amid the long histories of discrimination and systemic inequality, some towns have begun to chart a different course, demonstrating that progress is possible through education, activism, museums, and public awareness projects that seek to confront past injustices and foster a more inclusive society. In Pulaski, Tennessee, a town historically linked to the founding of the Ku Klux Klan, local efforts have emerged to counteract this painful legacy by highlighting stories of resilience and cultural preservation, such as the Unsung Heroes projects connected with the Trail of Tears Museum. These initiatives do not erase the past, but they offer a platform for education, reflection, and dialogue, allowing residents to engage with history critically and recognize the consequences of racism, while also celebrating the contributions and agency of marginalized communities. By fostering public understanding, these projects encourage both empathy and action, demonstrating that confronting uncomfortable truths is an essential step toward meaningful change. Activism plays a central role in many communities where historical and ongoing discrimination has left deep scars. In Crown Heights, New York, and similar urban neighborhoods, residents have organized forums, workshops, and public gatherings to address issues such as housing inequality, gun violence, and economic marginalization. These initiatives amplify the voices of Black residents, encouraging civic engagement and promoting dialogue across racial and socioeconomic divides. By doing activism transforms individual frustration and lived experiences into collective action, challenging entrenched systems while fostering a sense of shared responsibility for the future. The process is neither easy nor instantaneous, but even incremental victories such as policy reforms, local funding for social programs, or increased representation in local decision-making demonstrate the potential for change when communities mobilize around education and awareness. Museums and cultural institutions also serve as powerful tools for addressing historical and systemic racism. Exhibits that chronicle the experiences of Black Americans, from slavery to segregation to contemporary struggles, provide tangible and immersive experiences that connect abstract concepts to human stories. Visitors to such museums gain insight into both the structural forces that created inequality and the personal narratives that illuminate resilience, perseverance, and creativity. By framing these histories in accessible and engaging ways, museums can shift public perception, challenge stereotypes, and inspire new generations to advocate for equity and justice. These spaces become not just repositories of memory, but catalysts for learning, dialogue, and societal transformation. Public awareness projects extend beyond physical spaces, utilizing media, art, and community programming to inform and engage residents. From local art installations depicting the struggles and triumphs of marginalized communities to city-wide campaigns promoting inclusive policies and cross-cultural understanding, these projects demonstrate that storytelling and visibility are essential for dismantling prejudice. In cities where systemic inequities have long constrained opportunity, awareness efforts can illuminate paths to change. Fostering empathy, dialogue, and proactive engagement across diverse populations. By connecting these efforts to the broader narratives of historical violence, economic inequality, educational barriers, and residential segregation explored earlier, it becomes clear that progress is possible when communities commit to confronting injustice openly and creatively. Education, activism, museums, and public awareness projects do not erase systemic inequities overnight, but they cultivate a culture of accountability, reflection, and shared responsibility that lays the foundation for long-term change. These initiatives underscore the idea that combating racism requires not only structural reforms but also sustained social engagement, highlighting the ways in which informed, active, and empathetic communities can begin to reshape the landscape of opportunity. Understanding and equality for generations to come. As we reach the conclusion of this journey through the history and present reality of racial inequality in America, it becomes clear that ending prejudice and creating an equitable society is neither simple nor instantaneous. The challenges we have explored, from systemic barriers in education, employment, and housing to the legacies of slavery, segregation, and targeted violence, are deeply entrenched. But they are not immutable. Real change demands collective action, where every individual, community, and institution contributes to dismantling structures that perpetuate inequality. It begins with education, the first step in understanding the historical and social forces that have shaped current disparities. By teaching accurate histories, promoting critical thinking, and encouraging empathy, we can equip people of all ages to recognize bias and challenge stereotypes before they take root in future generations. Dialogue is equally essential. Honest conversations about race, privilege, and systemic discrimination create spaces where difficult truths can be acknowledged and addressed. Across towns and cities, community forums, school programs, and civic initiatives offer platforms for residents to voice experiences, share perspectives, and collaborate on solutions. These conversations can help break down misconceptions, build solidarity across diverse groups, and inspire collaborative approaches to local and national challenges. Change is rarely immediate, but sustained dialogue fosters the trust and understanding necessary for communities to work together effectively. Policy reform is another critical pillar in the fight against racial prejudice. Laws and regulations shape the conditions in which people live, work, and learn, and reforming policies that have historically disadvantaged Black communities can create tangible opportunities for progress. This includes addressing inequities in criminal justice, housing, healthcare, education, and voting rights, ensuring that systemic barriers are removed and that fairness is embedded into institutional frameworks. Equitable policies, combined with active enforcement and accountability, signal a societal commitment to justice and create a foundation on which long-term progress can be built. Yet, perhaps most importantly, combating racial prejudice requires the active engagement of individuals in everyday life. Each of us has the power to challenge bias when we encounter it, to support initiatives that promote inclusion, and to model behaviors that affirm the dignity and potential of every person. Whether through mentorship, volunteering, participating in civic processes, or simply amplifying marginalized voices, collective efforts accumulate to generate meaningful change. The examples we have seen in towns taking steps through education, activism, museums, and public awareness demonstrate that transformation is possible when communities choose to confront inequities head-on, even when the work is difficult and progress is gradual. As you reflect on the stories, statistics, and histories presented, remember that the fight against racial injustice is ongoing, but every action, small or large, matters. By committing ourselves to understanding, dialogue, advocacy, and reform, we can collectively shape a society where opportunities are not determined by race, where dignity is universally respected, and where future generations can thrive without the constraints of prejudice. Thank you for watching and taking the time to engage with these important issues. If you found this content insightful, inspiring, or thought-provoking, please support the channel by liking this video, sharing it with friends and family, and subscribing to stay updated on more stories that explore history, society, and justice. Your engagement helps amplify these conversations and ensures that awareness and education continue to reach wider audiences, contributing to a future beyond discrimination and inequality.